The clock that gave us time zones. Chapter 1. The town with 12 noons. In 1880, if you traveled from Maine to California, you'd pass through over 300 different time zones. Every city, town, and village set its clocks by the sun, each creating its own local time. Pittsburgh's noon wasn't Philadelphia's noon. Buffalo's noon differed from Boston's. This wasn't carelessness or confusion. It was logical. For thousands of years, humans had defined noon as the moment when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. This solar noon varied by longitude. Every degree of longitude, roughly 70 miles at mid-latitudes, shifted solar noon by 4 minutes. For most of human history, this didn't matter. If you lived your entire life in one town, you didn't care that the next town over experienced solar noon at a slightly different moment. Time was local because life was local. The church bell or town clock tower kept the town's time. The prominent citizens, the mayor, the priest, the schoolmaster, would consult almanacs to determine solar noon, then set the town clock accordingly. Everyone synchronized their pocket watches and the home clocks to the town clock. This system worked adequately for centuries. Farmers didn't need to coordinate with distant cities. Merchants did business within regions where time differences were minutes at most. The variation was noticeable but not problematic. But the railroad changed everything. Trains moved between towns at unprecedented speeds. A train traveling from Boston to Albany crossed dozens of local time zones. The conductor would need to reset his watch constantly, adjusting for each town's local time. Scheduling became nightmarish. How do you publish a train schedule when every stop has different time? A train departing Boston at 18 Ma Boston time might arrive in Worcester at 8:47. But which city's time? If you used Worcester time, the departure and arrival times couldn't be directly compared. The collision risk was real and deadly. When two trains used the same track, traveling in opposite directions, precise timing prevented disasters. But if the eastbound engineer's watch showed Worcester time and the westbound engineer's watch showed Springfield time, the safety margin could evaporate. Railroad companies initially tried to operate on their own time. Some railroads used the time of their headquarters city for all operations. Others tried to adjust for local times at each stop. Neither system worked well. The headquarters time confused passengers, and local time created scheduling chaos. By the 1870s, American railroads were using over 100 different time standards. A single station serving multiple railroads might have 3 or 4 different clocks showing railroad times, plus the town's local time. The Buffalo station famously had 3 clocks showing different times simultaneously. Passengers were perpetually confused. Arriving at a station, you might find the town clock showed 11:37. The railroad clock showed 11:53, and your pocket watch, set to your hometown time, showed 11:41. Which was correct? All of them and none of them. Missing trains was common. Travelers uncertain which clock to trust would arrive excessively early to avoid missing departures, or would arrive by what they thought was the correct time, only to watch their train pulling away. The economic cost of this temporal chaos was substantial. Delayed shipments, missed connections, inefficient railroad operations, all imposed costs that accumulated across the economy. The railroad industry needed a solution. Several proposals emerged. Some suggested dividing the country into time zones, regions that would share the same time regardless of local solar noon. Others argued for preserving local time, but having railroads publish schedules in standardized format. The resistance to time zones was fierce. Many people saw standardized time as unnatural, even sacrilegious. How could humans declare noon to be at 11:45 or 12:15 when the sun clearly disagreed? Wasn't this humanity's hubris, attempting to override natural law? Yet the practical problems were undeniable. Something had to change. The railroads were connecting the continent, but temporal chaos threatened to undermine the entire system. The solution would come not from government mandate, but from private coordination. The railroads themselves would impose standardized time, and on one day in November 1883, they would change how America measured time itself. The town with 12 noons, every town, really, was about to lose its temporal independence. The age of local time was ending. The age of time zones was beginning. If you love stories of the past, the kind that remind us how small inventions shaped the world, consider subscribing. We make these videos free so you can fall asleep learning something new about history. Your support helps us keep these quiet stories alive. Now let's get back to the video. Chapter 2. The Watchmaker's Precision. The standardization of time required accurate, reliable timekeeping. Before railroads could operate on coordinated schedules, they needed clocks and watches that could be trusted absolutely. This created enormous demand for precision timepieces. In the early 1800s, clockmaking was craft production. Skilled artisans built clocks individually, each one unique. These clocks were accurate by the standards of the day, losing or gaining perhaps a minute per day, but insufficient for railroad needs. Railroad operations demanded precision, measured in seconds, not minutes. A clock that gained even 30 seconds per day would be substantially wrong after a week. For scheduling trains and preventing collisions, this was unacceptable. The American watch industry transformed to meet railroad demands. Companies like Waltham Watch Company in Massachusetts pioneered interchangeable parts manufacturing for watches. This industrial approach produced watches with unprecedented consistency and reliability. The railroad-grade watch became a precisely defined standard. The specifications were rigorous. The watch must have at least 17 jewels, jeweled bearings that reduced friction, be adjusted to at least 5 positions, maintaining accuracy regardless of orientation, and be accurate to within 30 seconds per week. These requirements were demanding. Achieving such accuracy required careful manufacturing and individual adjustment. Each watch was tested extensively before being certified for railroad use. The watches were expensive. A quality railroad watch could cost $25 to $50, when the average worker earned perhaps $1 per day. Railroad companies mandated that engineers, conductors, and other time-critical personnel carry approved watches. The watches were inspected regularly by authorized watchmakers who certified their continued accuracy. A watch found to be running fast or slow could result in the employee's suspension. The inspection system was rigorous. Designated watch inspectors, typically jewelers who received special training, would check railroad employees' watches weekly or bi-weekly. The inspector compared each watch against a master clock, synchronized to the most accurate time available. The master clocks themselves required extraordinary accuracy. Many railroad stations installed astronomical regulators, precision pendulum clocks that could maintain accuracy to within a second per week. These regulators were often housed in temperature-controlled rooms to prevent expansion and contraction from affecting their timekeeping. the synchronization network emerged gradually. Western Union telegraph lines allowed time signals to be transmitted between cities. A master clock in one location could send electrical pulses to distant clocks, synchronizing them precisely. The U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. became an unofficial national time standard. The observatory had astronomical instruments for determining precise time from stellar observations. This astronomical time could be transmitted via telegraph to synchronize clocks across the country. The daily ritual developed. At a precise moment, often noon, Washington time, the Naval Observatory would send a telegraph signal. Telegraph operators across the country would receive this signal and adjust their station clocks accordingly. These station clocks became local time references. The technology was imperfect. Telegraph transmission introduced slight delays. Electrical signals traveled at finite speed through copper wires. Correcting for transmission delay required calculating the distance between telegraph stations and adjusting accordingly. The pocket watch became status symbol and essential tool simultaneously. Railroad men took pride in their watches. They were both expensive equipment and emblems of professional responsibility. The chain-worn pocket watch in the vest became iconic railroad worker appearance. The watch manufacturers marketed directly to railroad culture. Advertisement campaigns emphasized accuracy, reliability, and railroad approval. Brands like Hamilton, Elgin, and Illinois became synonymous with railroad timekeeping. The repair industry flourished. Even the best watches required periodic cleaning and adjustment. Jewelers, specializing in railroad watch repair, appeared in railroad towns. These watchmakers commanded respect. They maintained the timepieces that prevented disasters. The cultural shift was profound. Before railroads, most people owned no personal timepiece or had only approximate clocks. The railroad era made precise timekeeping personal and portable. Workers carried precision instruments in their pockets, aware of the exact minute throughout the day. The democratization of accurate time transformed daily life. Factories could coordinate shifts precisely. Schools could maintain strict schedules. Business appointments could be specified to the minute rather than vague parts of the day. But all this precision still operated on local time in the early 1880s. Each railroad hub had accurate clocks showing the city's solar time precisely. The watches of railroad employees showed their company's chosen time standard accurately. The temporal chaos had become precisely measured chaos. The watchmaker's precision had created the tools necessary for time standardization. But precision alone couldn't solve the fundamental problem: too many different times being measured too accurately. The solution would require not just better clocks, but a complete reconception of how time was defined. The pocket watch that kept perfect time in Pittsburgh showed a different perfect time than the watch in Philadelphia. The precision was the problem and the solution simultaneously. The stage was set for the Great Temporal Revolution. Chapter 3: The Railroad Man's Solution. William F. Allen was not a famous man. He was the editor of the Official Guide of the Railways, a publication listing train schedules for all American railroads. His job involved managing the temporal chaos daily, and he decided to end it. Allen understood the problem intimately. Every time a railroad changed schedules, he had to publish the changes in a format passengers could understand. But with over 100 different railroad time standards and hundreds of local times, clarity was impossible. He proposed a radical solution: divide the United States into 4 time zones. Within each zone, all clocks would show the same time, regardless of local solar noon. The zones would be roughly 15 degrees of longitude wide, 1 hour's difference in solar time. The proposal built on ideas that had circulated in railroad circles for years. Several people had suggested time zones, but no one had the industry position and determination to actually implement them. Allen did. In 1883, Allen was secretary of the General Time Convention, an association of railroad managers who met to coordinate scheduling issues. He used this position to advocate for his time zone system relentlessly. The practical advantages were clear to railroad managers. With 4 standard times instead of hundreds, schedule coordination would become manageable. Trains crossing zone boundaries would adjust their clocks by exactly 1 hour, a simple, predictable change. The zone boundaries were drawn pragmatically. Allen and the railroad managers didn't follow state borders or geographical features strictly. Instead, they placed boundaries where they would least disrupt railroad operations and major cities. The Eastern Zone would include the major northeastern cities. The Central Zone would cover the Midwest. The Mountain Zone would span the Rockies. The Pacific Zone would include the West Coast. Each zone's standard time would be the local solar time of a specific meridian, 75 degrees, 90 degrees, 105 degrees, and 120 degrees west longitude. Choice of meridians was careful. These longitudes passed through or near major railroad hubs, minimizing the time change cities would experience. New York's solar time was close to the 75th meridian time. Chicago was near the 90th meridian. The opposition was significant. Some railroad companies preferred their own time systems and resisted surrendering this independence. Smaller cities worried that standardizing on nearby cities' time would subordinate them psychologically. Religious objections were vocal. Ministers preached that God's time was solar time, noon when the sun was highest. Human-imposed time zones were seen as arrogant interference with divine natural order. Some called it the vandalism of barbarism. Astronomical purists agreed, for different reasons. Scientists argued that solar time was objectively correct. Any other definition of noon was arbitrary and divorced from natural phenomena. They preferred solving the railroad problem through better scheduling rather than changing time itself. But Allen persevered. He convinced railroad managers that the efficiency gains justified the controversy. And crucially, the railroads didn't need government approval. They could simply implement the system themselves. The date was set, Sunday, November 18th, 1883. On that day, participating railroads would adjust their clocks to the new standard times. The day became known as the Day of Two Noons because many cities would experience official noon twice as they transitioned to zone time. The implementation was coordinated via telegraph. At precisely noon, Eastern Standard Time, telegraph operators sent signals to every station. Clocks were stopped, advanced, or set back as needed. The entire railroad system synchronized to the new standard in a matter of hours. The precision of the coordination was remarkable. Thousands of station clocks across the continent adjusted simultaneously. Railroad workers had prepared for weeks, ensuring everyone understood the new system and exactly when to change their clocks. Not all railroads participated immediately. Some held out, continuing their own time standards. But the major railroads, controlling most of the track mileage and traffic, adopted the zones. The holdouts faced increasing pressure as connections with zone-using railroads became problematic. The public reaction was mixed. Some cities embraced the car this change, immediately adopting railroad time for civic purposes. Others resisted. Their city hall clocks continued showing local solar time even as the railroad station showed zone time. The legal authority was ambiguous. The railroads had no power to compel cities to adopt new time. They'd simply changed their own operations. But the practical influence was enormous. When the trains ran on zone time, everyone needed to reference that time to catch trains. Allen's solution wasn't perfect. The zone boundaries would be adjusted over subsequent years as communities lobbied for changes. Some places would resist time zones for decades. But the fundamental system, 4 zones with 1-hour offsets, was established on that November Sunday. The railroad man's solution succeeded because it was practical, not because it was mandated. The efficiency gains for railroads were immediate and substantial, and gradually the rest of society followed the railroads into standardized time. William F. Allen didn't invent time zones. The concept had been proposed before, but he made them real through determination, coordination, and the authority of the railroad industry. The obscure railroad schedule editor had changed how America measured time. Chapter 4. The Day of Two Noons. Sunday, November 18th, 1883, was chosen deliberately. Sunday was the lightest traffic day for railroads. Fewer trains meant less disruption during the transition. But for many American cities, it was a surreal day when time itself changed. In cities that needed to set clocks back, the transition was strange but not chaotic. The clock would reach, say, noon, then be reset to 11:47. Technically, the city experienced 13 minutes around noon twice. Church bells marking noon rang. Then 13 minutes later, technically rang noon again. Pittsburgh's experience was typical. The city's local solar time was about 13 minutes ahead of the new Eastern Standard Time. At noon, Pittsburgh solar time, the city's clocks were set back 13 minutes to 11:47. Noon would occur again at what had previously been 12:13. The newspapers covered the transition extensively, often with humor tinged with unease. Father Time reduced his speed, read one headline. Another joked that people could eat 2 lunches on the day with 2 noons. The levity masked genuine discomfort about temporal disruption. Religious services were complicated. Many ministers chose to preach about the time change, some opposing it as violation of natural order, others accepting it as practical necessity. A few held 2 services at the 2 different noons, satisfying both standards. Cities that needed to advance clocks faced different challenges. Some Chicago clocks jumped forward from 11:50 to noon, skipping 10 minutes of time. This felt less strange than backward movement. Time jumped ahead, as if those minutes never existed. New York's change was minimal, only about 4 minutes. The city's local time was close to the 75th meridian that defined Eastern Standard Time. For New Yorkers, the transition was barely noticeable. This was intentional. Allen had chosen meridians to minimize disruption to major cities. Detroit resisted. The city was geographically in the central zone, but wanted Eastern time to align with Eastern business partners. The city's clocks stayed on local time initially, creating a half-hour offset from zone time. This awkward compromise would persist for years. Bangor, Maine, was extreme, about 28 minutes ahead of Eastern Standard Time. Setting clocks back nearly half an hour felt substantial. Some Bangor residents refused. maintaining Bangor time on their personal watches while acknowledging railroad time for travel. The astronomical observatories objected formally. Harvard Observatory, the Naval Observatory, and others issued statements affirming that solar time was scientifically correct. They would continue using local solar time for astronomical work, creating a division between scientific and civil time. Telegraph operators were crucial to the coordination. They'd practiced for weeks, ensuring everyone understood the precise moment to adjust clocks. At noon Eastern Time, they sent synchronized telegraph signals. Across the country, station clocks changed in near-perfect coordination. The railroad workers experienced the transition most directly. Conductors and engineers had adjusted their watches that morning to zone time. They now operated on a time system that might differ from the towns they served. This required constant awareness of which time was meant in any context. Some accidents occurred during the confusion. A few trains missed connections due to misunderstandings about which time was meant. A train in Indiana reportedly nearly collided with another because the engineers had different interpretations of the transition schedule. These incidents were minor but highlighted the risks. The banks and businesses faced practical questions. If a contract specified payment on November 18th at noon, which noon? Was a loan due at solar noon or zone noon? The legal uncertainty created brief chaos in commercial districts. The courts would eventually rule that zone time became official at the moment of transition. Contracts specifying noon meant zone time noon if the transition had occurred. But this clarification took weeks, leaving initial uncertainty. Children were confused and delighted. Some teachers used the transition to teach about time, longitude, and the need for standardization. Others simply let students experience the strange day when clocks moved backward or jumped forward. Elderly residents struggled more than young people. If you'd lived 70 years with solar time, the change felt disorienting. Some older people never adjusted psychologically, always mentally converting zone time to real solar time. The day passed without catastrophe. No major railroad disasters occurred. The feared chaos didn't materialize. By Monday morning, most participating railroads were operating smoothly on zone time. But the cultural transition was just beginning. Having railroad station clocks show zone time didn't mean city hall clocks, church clocks, or personal watches immediately followed. In many places, two time standards coexisted for months or years. The acceptance came gradually, through practical necessity. If you needed to catch a train, you had to use railroad time. Businesses dealing with distant partners via telegraph needed to coordinate on zone time. The efficiency advantages compelled adoption. Some cities adopted zone time officially within weeks. Others resisted for years. Detroit maintained its half-hour offset until 1900. Some small towns kept solar time through the 1890s. But the trend was clear. Zone time was winning. The day of two noons was a peculiar moment in history. For a few hours, the natural and conventional definitions of time visibly diverged. The abstraction of standardized time became concrete experience. The clock said noon, but the sun disagreed. It was the day America accepted that time was what humans decided it was, not what the sun dictated. The day of two noons was the day we chose convenience over celestial mechanics, and there was no going back. Chapter 5. The Holdout Towns. Not everyone accepted time zones immediately. Scattered across America, towns and cities resisted. maintaining their local solar time in defiance of the new standard. Their resistance revealed the emotional and philosophical stakes of standardized time. Detroit's resistance was most notable. The city was geographically in the central time zone, but maintained Detroit time, local solar time, which was about 28 minutes ahead of Central and 32 minutes behind Eastern. The city's business connections were primarily eastward, making Eastern time logical, but the time difference was too large. The compromise was peculiar. Detroit adopted time halfway between Eastern and Central, 30 minutes ahead of Central, 30 minutes behind Eastern. This satisfied no one perfectly, but annoyed everyone minimally. The city maintained this idiosyncratic half-hour offset until 1900. Savannah, Georgia, similarly resisted. The city considered itself distinct from Atlanta and resented Atlanta's dominance in the region. Maintaining Savannah's local time was assertion of independence. The railroad serving Savannah used Central Time, but the city's clocks showed Savannah time. The practical result in these cities was temporal multiplication. The railroad station would have a clock showing railroad time. City Hall would show local time. Businesses might show either, depending on their relationships. Residents needed to track multiple time standards simultaneously. Augusta, Georgia, went further, refusing to acknowledge time zones at all. The city's newspaper published a lengthy editorial declaring that God's time, solar time, was the only legitimate time. Man-made zones were an invention of railroad magnates for their convenience, not the people's benefit. The philosophical objection was real for many. Time zones meant noon could occur when the sun was nowhere near its zenith. In western parts of time zones, solar noon might be 12:30 or later. This seemed unnatural, a violation of observable reality. Preachers in conservative religious communities often opposed zones. The argument was theological. God had created the sun to mark time. Genesis spoke of the sun ruling the day. For humans to declare noon at 11:45 or 12:20, solar time was hubris, placing human convenience over divine order. Some communities compromised by officially adopting zone time, but maintaining church time at solar noon. Sunday services and church events would be scheduled by solar time, while weekday commercial activity used zone time. This dual system reflected the sacred secular division. Cincinnati maintained local time unusually long until 1890. The city's influential citizens included several astronomers and scientists who argued that solar time was scientifically correct and abandoning it was regressive. The city became symbol of resistance to temporal standardization. The courts faced timing disputes. What if a will specified a deadline at noon on a particular day? Was that solar noon or zone noon? In holdout cities, this ambiguity created legal chaos. Eventually, courts ruled that unless specified otherwise, legal time meant the time standard officially adopted by the jurisdiction. This created incentive for official adoption. Cities maintaining unofficial dual time systems faced legal uncertainty that affected contracts, deadlines, and court proceedings. Business interests typically pressured for clarification, which meant official zone time adoption. The schools were battlegrounds. Some school boards insisted on teaching that solar time was correct, and zone time was an arbitrary convention. Others taught that zone time was the practical standard students needed to know. Teachers sometimes received conflicting guidance. The generational divide was clear. Older residents tended to resist zone time, maintaining solar time on personal watches. Younger people, especially those with railroad connections or business dealings beyond local areas, adopted zone time pragmatically. The rural resistance persisted longest. Farmers worked by the sun. Sunrise to sunset defined their workday. The specific clock time of these events was irrelevant. Whether noon was solar or zone time mattered little when you ate when hungry and slept when dark. But even rural areas were increasingly integrated into market economies. Shipping agricultural products via railroad required coordination on railroad time. Farmers might personally use solar time, but had to reference zone time for commercial interactions. The political resistance emerged in some state legislatures. Bills were introduced to legally define the state's time standard. Some legislators argued for solar time, others for zone time, still others for state-specific standards. These debates were often acrimonious. The federal government's absence was notable. Time zones were created by private railroad coordination, not government mandate. This meant no federal authority enforced time zones. Cities were free to ignore them, though practical consequences made this increasingly untenable. Some businesses capitalized on the confusion. A jeweler might sell solar time pocket watches alongside zone time watches, serving customers with different preferences. This market-based approach allowed coexistence of both standards. The international complications were significant. Canada adopted time zones similarly to the United States, but with different boundary locations. Border cities faced additional complexity. The Canadian and American zones didn't always align at the border. Mexico resisted time zones longer, not adopting them officially until 1922. This created chaos along the US-Mexico border, where American border towns used zones, but Mexican counterparts used local times. International commerce struggled with the temporal mismatch. The holdout towns gradually surrendered. The practical disadvantages of non-standard time became overwhelming. Businesses lost advantages to competitors using standard time. Residents were perpetually confused about train schedules. The social costs exceeded any principled benefit. By 1900, most significant holdouts had officially adopted zone time. A few small towns maintained local solar time into the 20th century. The last known American community using local time officially was somewhere in rural Kentucky, abandoning it around 1920. The resistance was more than stubbornness. It represented genuine philosophical objections to standardization, concern about urban dominance over rural areas, and discomfort with prioritizing technological convenience over natural rhythms. But the holdouts were fighting inevitable change. The connected, industrialized society required temporal coordination. Local time was incompatible with telegraphs, railroads, and national markets. The holdout towns eventually accepted this, however reluctantly. The last solar noon, kept by a town clock somewhere in rural America, marked the end of an era. Time had become standardized, rationalized, and divorced from the sun's position. The holdouts had lost, and with them died the ancient connection between time and celestial observation. Chapter 6. The International Dateline's Logic. While America struggled with time zones, the world faced an even stranger problem. If you traveled west far enough, you'd lose a day. If you traveled east, you'd gain one. The International Dateline was necessary to prevent temporal paradoxes. The issue was fundamental. Earth rotates through 360 degrees in 24 hours, 15 degrees per hour. If If you traveled westward fast enough to match Earth's rotation, you could keep the sun at the same position indefinitely. Time would effectively stop. In practice, this meant that circumnavigating the globe created a one-day discrepancy. Travel eastward around the world, and you'd experience 25 hours per calendar day, counting the time zone changes. Travel westward, and you'd experience only 23 hours per calendar day. The mathematics was inexorable. 24 time zones of 1 hour each totaled 24 hours, a full day. Complete a circuit either direction, and you needed to add or subtract a day somewhere to reconcile your personal count with the calendar. The problem wasn't theoretical. Ferdinand Magellan's crew, completing the first circumnavigation in 1522, discovered they'd lost a day. Their ship's log showed 1 day fewer than the date in Spain when they returned. The confusion was profound. Had they miscounted, or had something stranger happened? The explanation was time zones before time zones existed. Traveling westward, they'd effectively extended each day slightly. Accumulated over months, these extensions totaled 24 hours, 1 full day. Their count was correct for their experience, but they'd been traveling against Earth's rotation. Similar discrepancies appeared throughout the age of exploration. Ship's captains traveling around the globe would find their calendars differed from local calendars upon arrival. Some thought they'd made calculation errors. Others suspected supernatural causes. The solution was the International Date Line, an imaginary line roughly following the 180th meridian where the calendar date changes. Cross the line westward and you skip forward a day. Cross eastward and you repeat a day. The logic was simple. This discontinuity had to exist somewhere. If there are 24 time zones spanning the globe, somewhere must be the boundary where zone plus 112 meets zone 12. That boundary needs to be a calendar date change, or the system doesn't work. The 180th meridian was chosen because it passed mostly through the Pacific Ocean, affecting minimal land areas. The line could be drawn through water, minimizing the number of people who'd live directly on the date boundary. But even in the ocean, the line had to deviate from the meridian. Island chains and territories couldn't be split across different calendar days. The line bent around Aleutian Islands, Fiji, Tonga, and other Pacific lands, keeping each territory on one side or the other. These deviations created odd situations. The Diomede Islands in the Bering Strait are only 2.4 miles apart, but sit on opposite sides of the date line. Big Diomede, Russian, is 21 hours ahead of Little Diomede, American. You can see tomorrow from today across a narrow strait. Samoa and Samoa, American Samoa, and the independent nation of Samoa are similarly separated. Samoa changed which side of the date line it was on in 2011, aligning with Australia and New Zealand, rather than American Samoa and the United States. The nations are now 24 hours apart despite being neighbors. The date line created the strange possibility of celebrating the same event twice. If you crossed the line eastward on your birthday, you'd repeat the day, celebrating your birthday again. Westward crossing meant skipping the day. You could miss your birthday entirely. The international politics were complex. The date line wasn't established by treaty or international agreement. It evolved from practical shipping and colonial administrative needs. Different colonial powers placed their Pacific territories on whichever side of the line suited their administration. The scientific community needed a prime meridian for longitude measurement. the 1884 International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., established the Greenwich Meridian as zero longitude. This implicitly placed the opposite side of the globe, the 180th meridian, as the logical date boundary. But this was recommendation, not mandate. Nations weren't required to adopt Greenwich Mean Time or recognize the date line. Many did for practical reasons. Navigational charts, international commerce, and telegraph coordination all benefited from standardization. The date line intersected with time zone adoption. As nations implemented time zones in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they had to decide which side of the date line they'd place territories near the boundary. These decisions sometimes reflected political or economic alliances more than geography. The aviation age added new wrinkles. Flying across the date line meant passengers might arrive before they departed, in clock time. A flight leaving Tokyo Monday evening might arrive in San Francisco Monday morning, despite a 10-hour flight. The temporal discontinuity confused travelers, but was mathematically consistent. The date line demonstrated time's conventionality more dramatically than time zones. Time zones meant noon wasn't when the sun was highest. Strange, but comprehensible. The date line meant Tuesday. On one side of an imaginary line was Wednesday on the other side, a calendar change purely by human convention. Yet this strangeness was necessary. Without the date line discontinuity, the global time zone system couldn't function coherently. The oddity was the price of temporal standardization across a spherical planet that rotates. The philosophical implications were profound. The dateline proved that calendar dates were human constructs, not natural facts. There was no objective Tuesday, only zones where humans agreed to call it Tuesday. The line between Tuesday and Wednesday was wherever we decided to draw it. The international date line was invisible, arbitrary, and absolutely necessary. It was the logical consequence of standardizing time globally while living on a rotating sphere. And like time zones themselves, it represented humanity's choice to organize time by convention rather than celestial observation. The logic of the date line was inescapable. The paradox it prevented was real. And the solution, an imaginary line in the Pacific where the calendar jumps, was strange but functional. The world's clocks required this discontinuity to tell time coherently. Chapter 7. The Railroad Watch Inspector. In every railroad town, one person held special authority, the watch inspector. This individual, usually a jeweler with advanced training, maintained the temporal accuracy that prevented disasters. The profession embodied the intersection of precision, craftsmanship, and industrial safety. The railroad watch inspector's shop was shrined to precision. Master clocks, astronomical regulators often housed in glass cases, kept time accurate to within a second per week. These were the reference against which all railroad watches were judged. The inspector's training was rigorous. Ball Watch Company, Hamilton, and other railroad watch manufacturers offered certification programs. Inspectors learned watch repair, regulation, and the specific requirements of railroad timekeeping standards. The weekly ritual was formal. Railroad employees would bring their watches to the inspector's shop, typically on designated days. The inspector would compare each watch against the master clock, noting any deviation in an official record book. The tolerance was strict. 30 seconds variance per week was the maximum allowable error. A watch gaining or losing more than 30 seconds would fail inspection. The employee would need to have the watch regulated, adjusted to run accurately before the next inspection. The regulation process was precise art. The inspector would open the watch, adjusting the balance wheel and hairspring to alter its running rate. This required understanding how temperature, position, and magnetism affected timekeeping. Each watch was an individual mechanism requiring specific adjustments. The inspection certificate was official document. Inspectors would fill out cards noting the watch's accuracy, the date of inspection, and any adjustments made. Employees carried these certificates as proof their watches met railroad standards. The authority was absolute. An inspector could reject any watch, regardless of its cost or the employee's protests. If a watch couldn't be regulated to meet standards, it was prohibited for railroad service. The inspector's judgment on timekeeping was final. The business model was interesting. Inspectors charged fees for inspections, typically 50 cents to $1 per inspection. This provided steady income. They also sold railroad-approved watches and performed repairs. The most successful inspectors became wealthy, serving railroad communities. The Ball Watch Company built a business model entirely around watch inspection. Webb C. Ball established a network of authorized inspectors, standardized inspection procedures, and sold Ball-branded watches guaranteed to meet railroad standards. His company became synonymous with railroad timekeeping. The time signal service was crucial. Most inspectors received daily telegraph time signals from the Naval Observatory or other astronomical references. At precisely noon, or another designated time, a telegraph signal would arrive, allowing the inspector to verify the master clock's accuracy. The ritual of the noontime ball was dramatic. Many inspectors had large time ball mechanisms, spheres mounted on towers that would drop at exactly noon, visible throughout town. Residents could set their watches by observing the ball drop, synchronized to the inspector's master clock. The social status was significant. Watch inspectors were respected professionals, part of the railroad industry's essential infrastructure. They attended industry conventions, received technical updates from watch manufacturers, and were considered authorities on precision and accuracy. The disaster prevention was their responsibility. Every train collision avoided because crews had accurate, synchronized time was partly the inspector's achievement. The weight of this responsibility was real. Lives depended on their precision. The famous disasters reinforced the system's importance. The 1891 Kipton, Ohio train collision, caused by an engineer's stopped watch, killed 9 people. The incident led to stricter watch inspection standards and more frequent inspections. The inspector's role became even more critical. The technology evolved with the inspectors. As watch designs improved, inspectors received training on new mechanisms. The development of more stable balance wheels, temperature-compensated balance springs, and better escapements gave inspectors improved tools, but also new complexities to master. The competition was subtle. In larger cities, multiple inspectors might serve different railroad companies. These inspectors competed on reputation. The most skilled inspectors attracted more business, but they also cooperated, sharing information about problematic watch models or new regulation techniques. The decline came slowly. As other timing methods developed, especially radio time signals, the watch inspector's centrality decreased. But through the age of steam, and into the diesel era, inspectors remained essential to railroad operations. The last traditional watch inspectors worked into the 1960s and 1970s. As railroads modernized signaling and adopted electronic timekeeping, the pocket watch era ended. The inspector's profession became historical curiosity rather than vital necessity. But the legacy persisted. The precision culture the inspectors fostered, the insistence on accuracy, the respect for properly maintained timepieces, the understanding that safety depended on synchronized time, shaped railroad culture permanently. The inspector's shop, with its master clocks and regulation tools, was temple to precision. The inspector was priest of time, maintaining the standards that allowed industrial society to function. The profession embodied the transformation from local, approximate time to standardized, precise coordination. Every watch that passed inspection carried the inspector's certification, a guarantee of accuracy within the strict tolerances industrial timekeeping demanded. And every train that departed on schedule, every connection made, every collision avoided, was testament to the inspector's work. The railroad watch inspector was unsung hero of the time zone era, not famous like the engineers or executives, but essential. The person who ensured that time meant the same thing, to the second, across the railroad network. Chapter 8. The Government's Surrender. For decades after railroads adopted time zones, the U.S. government refused to officially recognize them. This created a strange situation. The country operated on a time system that had no legal status. The government's eventual surrender represented the victory of practical necessity over official authority. The legal ambiguity was genuine. The Constitution didn't grant the federal government authority to regulate time. Time zones were created by private railroad coordination. Cities and states could officially adopt zone time or ignore it. Neither choice violated federal law. Many cities did adopt zone time officially, recognizing it in city ordinances and setting public clocks accordingly. But this was municipal or state action, not federal. The United States had no official standard time. This created jurisdictional confusion. If a federal contract specified a deadline at noon, which noon? Solar time at the contract location? The local time zone time? The ambiguity had potential legal implications. The Congress was reluctant to act. Some legislators argued that regulating time was state or local matter, not federal responsibility. Others worried about political backlash from constituents attached to local solar time. The issue seemed too trivial for major legislation, yet too contentious to address casually. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created in 1887 to regulate railroads, had implicit authority over railroad timekeeping, but the ICC focused on rates, routes, and safety regulations. It didn't assert authority to mandate time zones, despite their railroad origins. The military used zone time internally, but couldn't mandate its use by civilians. Army and Navy facilities operated on zone time, and military orders specified times in standard time. But this was internal military coordination, not civilian legal requirement. The courts addressed specific disputes without establishing broad precedent. When timing questions appeared in legal cases, judges would typically rule based on the locally accepted time standard. In cities using zone time, that became the legal standard. In holdout cities, solar time might still apply. The practical adoption proceeded without government involvement. Businesses, schools, and organizations adopted zone time because it was convenient and aligned with railroad schedules. The system worked through voluntary coordination rather than legal mandate. The turning point was international standardization. Britain, France, and other European nations officially adopted time zones and designated standard meridians. American diplomatic and commercial relationships increasingly required coordinating on international time standards. The 1918 Standard Time Act finally established federal authority. The legislation defined 4 continental U.S. time zones and authorized the Interstate Commerce Commission to establish their boundaries. The act was part of broader World War I emergency measures. The timing was significant. World War I required unprecedented coordination across geography and time. Military operations, munitions production, and resource allocation all demanded synchronized timing. The federal government needed authority to mandate standard time. The opposition was muted by wartime necessity. Critics who might have fought federal time regulation accepted it as war measure. The legislation passed with relatively little controversy, despite decades of resistance to similar proposals. The daylight saving time provision was more controversial. The 1918 Act also established national daylight saving time, advancing clocks by 1 hour during summer months. This was explicitly a war measure, intended to conserve energy for war production. The DST was wildly unpopular. Rural areas particularly resented the disruption to agricultural rhythms. After the war ended, Congress repealed the DST provision in 1919 over President Wilson's veto. Standard time zones remained, but the 1-hour summer shift was abandoned federally. The repeal didn't prevent states and cities from adopting DST independently. Many did, creating new temporal chaos. Some cities advanced clocks in summer, while neighbors didn't. The patchwork DST adoption created scheduling confusion similar to the pre-zone era. The permanent federal DST authorization came decades later. The Uniform Time Act of 1966 established national DST standards, requiring states to observe DST unless they officially opted out. This created more uniformity, though individual states could still choose not to participate. The government's surrender was gradual and reluctant. From 1883, when railroads implemented zones, to 1918, when federal law recognized them, the government avoided asserting authority. The 35-year gap demonstrated the limits of government power over de facto social arrangements. The zones that government eventually recognized were essentially the zones railroads had created. The boundaries were adjusted slightly, and legal authority formalized them. But the basic system was the one William F. Allen and the railroad managers had designed. This reversed the typical pattern. Usually, government establishes standards that private industry follows. With time zones, private industry established the standard, operated under it for decades, and government finally acknowledged reality by giving legal recognition to the existing system. The philosophical implications were interesting. Time standardization succeeded through voluntary coordination based on shared practical interests. Legal authority wasn't necessary for the system to function. It evolved from railroad needs and was adopted because it worked. But legal recognition did provide benefits. It clarified contractual ambiguities, established official boundaries, and created federal authority to resolve disputes. The government didn't create time zones, but official recognition consolidated and legitimized them. The international coordination continued evolving. Time zones were established globally through a combination of national legislation and international conventions. The system became one of the most successful examples of international standardization, operating across borders with minimal friction. The government's surrender to railroad time was complete. What began as private coordination became national standard, became international system. The official authority eventually acknowledged what practical reality had established. Time zones were how modern society measured time. The reluctance had delayed, but not prevented the inevitable. Time zones worked too well to be stopped by official indifference. The government's eventual embrace simply formalized what had become undeniable. Time was no longer what the sun said it was. Time was what the railroad clocks said it was. Chapter 9. The Philosopher's Question continued. The traditional view held that time was natural and objective. Noon was when the sun reached its zenith. This was observable fact, not human convention. Every location had its own true noon, determined by celestial mechanics. This view aligned with thousands of years of human experience. Ancient sundials measured time by the sun's shadow. Every culture developed calendars based on observable celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar phases. Time was what happened in the sky, but time zones declared that noon could occur when the sun was nowhere near its highest point. In the western portions of each zone, solar noon might be 12:30 or later by zone time. The clock said noon, but the sun clearly disagreed. This created philosophical tension. If time was a natural phenomenon, how could humans simply declare it to be different? Wasn't that like declaring water to flow uphill or gravity to pull sideways? The pragmatist philosophers, particularly American thinkers like William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, engaged with this question directly. They argued that time was whatever proved useful for human purposes. If standardized time worked better than solar time, it was truer in the practical sense that mattered. This pragmatic approach prioritized consequences over abstract correctness. Solar time might be naturally correct, but it created practical problems. Zone time was conventionally correct and solved those problems. Therefore, zone time was the better truth. The European philosophers took different approaches. Henry Bergson distinguished between clock time, the mathematical, standardized time of physics and society, and duration, the lived, subjective experience of time's passage. Time zones affected clock time, but not duration. Bergson argued that humans had confused clock time with real time. The standardization of time was standardization of measurement, not of the phenomenon being measured. Time itself, as experienced, as lived, couldn't be standardized because it was inherently subjective. This distinction offered resolution to the contradiction. Solar time and zone time were both systems for measuring time, not time itself. Neither was truer than the other. Both were conventions for coordinating human activity around a shared temporal reference. The scientists entered the debate from different angle. Physicists noted that time measurement was always conventional. Even solar time was a convention, choosing to define noon by the sun's position rather than some other reference point was human decision. Einstein's special relativity, published in 1905, further complicated matters. Einstein demonstrated that time itself was relative. Different observers moving at different speeds would measure time differently. There was no absolute universal time, only time as measured within specific reference frames. This didn't directly address time zones, but it undermined the notion that any particular time standard was uniquely correct. If time was relative for fundamental physical reasons, the choice between solar and zone time was clearly conventional. The theologians were split. Some maintained that solar time was God's time, the natural order created in Genesis. Others argued that God had given humans dominion over creation, including the authority to organize time for human flourishing. The Catholic Church, with its global organization and need for coordination across continents, pragmatically adopted time zones. The Vatican operated on Central European time, not Rome's solar time. Practical necessity overrode theological attachment to solar time. The ordinary people mostly didn't engage with philosophical questions. They used whatever time the clock showed and the trains ran by. But the adjustment required psychological shift, accepting that noon was a convention rather than a natural fact. The cultural narratives evolved. Before time zones, stories and songs referenced the sun's position as absolute temporal reference. High noon meant solar noon, a specific, observable moment. After time zones, cultural references to time became more abstract. The language changed subtly. People stopped saying, when the sun is highest, and started saying, at 12 o'clock. The shift from solar reference to clock reference reflected deeper conceptual change. Time was what the agreed-upon clock said, not what the sky showed. The philosopher's question didn't have definitive answer. Instead, society collectively answered through adoption. Time became conventional by convention, a self-fulfilling definition. When everyone agreed to use zone time became the time that mattered. This revealed something profound. Much of what seems natural and objective is actually human agreement. Time zones demonstrated that society could collectively redefine basic categories like noon and make the redefinition stick through sheer coordination. The question, what is time, received a new answer. Time is what we agree it is. This was pragmatic, perhaps unsatisfying to those seeking objective truth, but it was functional, and in a society coordinated by railroads and telegraphs, function mattered more than philosophy. The philosopher's question remained open for contemplation, but society had moved on. The clock showed zone time, the trains ran on schedule, and whether that time was true or merely conventional mattered less than the fact that it worked. Chapter 10. The Clock That Waits. It's quiet now. On a wall somewhere near you, there's probably a clock. It shows a number, perhaps 11:47, perhaps 9:23, perhaps any of the infinite moments between midnight and midnight. That number is your time zone's time, synchronized across hundreds or thousands of miles. Tomorrow morning, you'll glance at that clock to know when to wake, when to leave, when to arrive. You'll coordinate your day around the time it shows, trusting that this time matches the time everyone else in your zone is following. Think about that trust. The clock's time isn't determined by the sun in your sky. Depending on where you live within your zone, solar noon might occur 30 minutes before or after the clock's noon. But this doesn't matter because everyone in your zone shares the same conventional noon. That sharing, that agreement, is what makes modern life possible. When you schedule a call for 2 p.m., both parties know exactly what 2 p.m. means. When a train departs at 8:47, passengers can arrive at 8:40, confident the train will still be there. This coordination was impossible before time zones. The 1880s traveler moving between cities couldn't know what time the next town kept. Every locality was its own temporal island, isolated in its unique relationship with the sun. The railroad changed this by making the isolation unbearable. When towns were connected by rails, when telegraph wires carried instant messages across distances, when business increasingly operated across geography, the temporal fragmentation became obstacle rather than quirk. William F. Allen and the railroad managers solved this through time zones, not because they sought philosophical truth, but because they needed trains to run safely and efficiently. The solution was pragmatic, even crude, but it worked. Think about what was surrendered. The intimate connection between local time and local sky was severed. Your noon became divorced from your sun's position. The clock became master and the sun became irrelevant, at least for timekeeping. Some resisted this surrender. They saw it as hubris, as a violation of natural order, as subordination to railroad interests. And they weren't entirely wrong. Time zones did prioritize industrial coordination over celestial observation. But the practical benefits overwhelmed the philosophical objections. The efficiency gains, the safety improvements, the coordination possibilities, these created unstoppable momentum towards standardization. Holdout towns eventually yielded because isolation became untenable. The government's reluctance to officially recognize time zones for 35 years revealed the strangeness of the situation. A fundamental social convention, how society measured time, operated without legal authority. Yet it worked through voluntary coordination. This demonstrated something profound about social order. Not everything requires government mandate. Sometimes coordination emerges from practical necessity, with participants adopting shared standards because the alternatives are worse. The watch inspectors embodied this coordinated precision. Their weekly rituals of checking railroad workers' watches, their master clocks synchronized by telegraph to astronomical observations, their authority to reject timepieces that didn't meet standards, all this infrastructure emerged to support standardized time. The precision became cultural value. Before railroads, most people didn't own watches. Time was approximate: morning, afternoon, evening. After railroads, many carried pocket watches, aware of the exact minute. Punctuality became virtue in ways it hadn't been before. Think about how this changed daily experience. Your ancestors 200 years ago might have been vaguely aware of the hour. You know the minute, constantly. The acceleration of temporal precision mirrored the acceleration of life's pace. The time zones we inherited are essentially unchanged from 1883. The boundaries have been adjusted, daylight saving time has been added and debated, but the 4 continental US zones remain as Allen designed them. This 140-year-old system still structures American time. Globally, time zones became universal standard. Nearly every nation adopted them, creating a worldwide temporal grid. The 24 zones spanning the globe, with the international datelines' strange discontinuity, organize planetary time. The technology evolved beyond recognition. The precision pocket watches of railroad inspectors gave way to quartz watches, atomic clocks, and GPS satellite time signals. But the zone system persists. Technology changed while the organizational principle endured. The philosophical question remains unresolved. Is time what clocks measure or what we experience? Is noon a natural fact or social convention? The answer might be both, depending on context. Time contains objective and subjective elements inseparably mixed. Your clock waits on the wall, its hands or digits moving with mechanical or electronic precision. It doesn't care about solar noon. It shows zone time because that's what it's set to show, what everyone around you has agreed to recognize. Tomorrow, you'll live by that clock. You'll schedule appointments, catch trains or planes, coordinate with others, all based on the zone time that has no necessary connection to the sun outside your window. This is the legacy of November 18th, 1883, the day of two noons, when America accepted conventional time over celestial time. The railroad's practical needs reshaped how society measured and experienced time itself. The clocks that resulted are monuments to coordination over chaos, efficiency over tradition, agreement over individual observation. They represent one of history's quiet revolutions, the moment time became what we agreed it was rather than what nature dictated. Sleep well. Your clock knows what time it is, even if that time is an hour or more different from what the sun suggests. And tomorrow, that clock will wake you, guide you, coordinate your day with millions of others sharing your zone's conventional noon. The revolution succeeded so completely that it became invisible. You don't think about time zones. You just live within one. The strangeness of conventional time has become normal, the coordination so seamless that you notice it only when it fails. From Galvani's frog to Volta's pile, from Pittsburgh's solar noon to Eastern Standard Time, from individual town clocks to synchronized zones, the journey transformed time from local natural fact to global social convention. The clock that gave us time zones hangs on your wall. It waits patiently, precisely, conventionally marking time. Not sun time, not star time, not natural time, but our time. The time we agreed upon, the time that holds modern society together. Tomorrow it will wake you at a number, 7, 6, 8. That means the same thing to everyone in your zone. And that shared meaning, that coordinated moment, is the gift of the railroad clock and the time zones it created. Sleep well. The clock knows what time it is. And so do you, because we all agreed. The time that waits is the time we made, and it's waiting for tomorrow. One synchronized second at a time.